Hi, Anita recap here. In this video, we're going to recap a horror movie from the year 2019 called Candy Corn. The movie opens with a group of young people named Mike, Steve, Carol, and Bobby who are discussing their annual event, which is always held every Halloween night. They often bully an outcast who has no friends and is always aloof. That man is Jacob Atkins. But this year, Mike has a fresh idea that can make their bullying more exciting than just bullying Jacob in an empty house from year to year. This year, Mike wants to bully him in public, specifically at a carnival in town. This is because according to the information that Mike got, Jacob is working there during Halloween night. All the men agree with Mike's idea, but not with Carol, who wants them to find something more useful to do that night than having to bully Jacob again. Despite Carol's refusal, Mike wants all his friends to agree with his idea, because they still need additional members to complete their plan for Halloween night. They then invite Gus, the restaurant waiter who would take them to the carnival. Gus is very excited to join the gang because it would revive his long-buried young soul. Then the scene moves to Jacob Atkins, an ordinary guy who is just sitting in front of the table while eating some snacks. Tonight is a different night for Jacob because he will work as one of the crew at a carnival. Jacob takes his Halloween bag and rides his bicycle through the woods to the place where the carnival is being held. When he gets there, it turns out that Jacob is late because his boss, Dr. Death, is already getting ready. Dr. Death warns Jacob to focus more if he wants to be taken on a city tour that would be organized by him. Jacob just nods as if he understands what his boss says. Afterwards, the program starts and Dr. Death welcomes all visitors who have bought the tickets to watch his show. Meanwhile, Jacob, who is alone at that time, is approached by Mike and his friends. As usual, he gets bullied by them, which makes him try to fight back. However, because Jacob is a geeky guy, he makes the group of guys angry and eventually they beat him so badly that Jacob gets seriously injured. The men are shocked and scared about the consequences of their action at the time, but Bobby argues that they were only doing it to protect themselves. Meanwhile, Jacob, who has died due to the injuries he's gotten, is finally found by Dr. Death, who knows that his death is due to the actions of the bullies. Because he still wants to see Jacob alive, Dr. Death suddenly opens a box containing a mask and a doll. He then starts a voodoo ritual, casting a spell and asking all the spirits to help him resurrect Jacob. At first, Dr. Death is skeptical and doesn't believe that Jacob could come back to life. The spell works when he sees a black silhouette slowly rising. The scene moves to a sheriff whose name is Sam. At that time, he is on patrol when his colleague named Marcy informs him that he has a guest who wants to talk to him. Sam, who had received the report, finally goes straight to the station, but on the way he sees a man with a body covered in blood. Out of curiosity, Sam approaches the house and asks the man, who tells him to leave quickly. Weirdly, no one is there, so Sam decides to go to the station. Arriving at the station, it turns out that the person who wants to talk to him is Carol. Feeling scared and nervous, Carol tells Sam that last night, she and her friends visited the carnival. There they harassed Jacob, and when Jacob hits Mike, everyone just beats Jacob back until he got seriously injured and possibly have died. Right now, she doesn't know what to do. Understanding how young people are today, Sam asks Carol to stay calm and let them take care of the case. Sam goes straight to Carnival and asks Dr. Death about the incident that happened last night, but Dr. Death only tells Sam that Jacob is fine after he was treated last night. After receiving information from Dr. Death, Sam tries to check Jacob's house, but after several knocks on the door, there is no answer. Meanwhile, Carol, who is currently resting, is startled by the loud ringing of the telephone. She picks up the phone, and while listening to the person speaking on the phone, she is suddenly surprised by a man wearing a mask. It turns out that it's Steve who wants to surprise her, then she lets him inside. Carol wants Steve to not bother Jacob anymore because she doesn't want Steve to get in trouble. He promises not to do it again and that it was the last one. Then he says goodbye and would pick her up after he finishes work. Then Carol left the house to go to pick up some food at a restaurant. While waiting, Carol reads the news about the strange people who control the carnival. She is suddenly startled by the presence of Mike, who is angry that Carol complained to his father, the sheriff, about last night's incident. Mike warns Carol not to do that anymore. If not, she will suffer the consequences. After that, Mike just leaves. The scene moves to Gus, who is in the toilet, where he imagines the beautiful body of one of his co-workers. When Gus gets upset that it is just a fantasy, he gets his business done first and leaves. While looking in the mirror, Gus is surprised by a pumpkin basket and the presence of a bloody man with a mask on. At first, Gus warns the man not to mess with him, but suddenly the man attacks Gus, strangles him, and stabs him until Gus bleeds to death. Meanwhile, Steve is surprised to see Carol, who visits him at work even though he told Carol that he would pick her up after work. Carol reasons that she just wants to surprise Steve. When the two of them were making out, one of Steve's colleagues suddenly comes and tells them that somebody had murdered Gus. Hearing the news makes them all very shocked, while Sam and his colleagues, Fox and Conrad, immediately try to secure the situation. They see the bloodied body of Gus with his teeth almost completely pulled out and replaced with candy corn. Sam is shocked, but he still can't quite figure out who did all this. Feeling that this case is very urgent, Sam tells his colleagues to go to the office so they can make a report on the murder. Not long after they come to find out what happens, their arrival is immediately blocked by Sam, who asks them both to tell what happens that night. Finally, they are brought to the station where Steve explains that Gus drove them to the carnival in his car that night. Since Steve and Carol have nothing to do with the case of Gus' murder, Sam asks them both to not panic and tells them to go home. After that, Sam asks Conrad to go on patrol, while he and Fox will try to find out the motive behind Gus' murder by questioning Dr. Death. Then the scene moves to a group of young men who have killed Jacob, who are now panicking. Meanwhile, the killer Mike asks them to stay calm. He knows that Gus died, but he doesn't want to believe that Jacob had killed him. Steve explains that the sheriffs found candy corn in Gus' mouth, Jacob's favorite candy, but still Mike asks them not to think about it anymore. When Mike had left, Bobby suddenly hears a ringing sound. This time he is the victim of Jacob, who has become an undead. Jacob pushed Bobby against the wall, then pulls out of his spine. On one hand, Sam, who has come for Dr. Death, finally manages to get him to speak in private. At that time, Sam doesn't blame Dr. Death, he just wants to ask for information on where exactly Jacob is right now. However, Dr. Death is seen trying to cover up the case by upsetting Sam, and soon Conrad comes to tell them that the second murder had just occurred. Finally, they go to the crime scene, where they find the body of Bobby that is lying with his spine missing. Feeling the situation is getting more dangerous, Sam goes to the station telling Marcy to contact the media to broadcast this news. Meanwhile, he asks Conrad to immediately patrol and notify the locals that they would implement a curfew. Anyone who is seen leaving the house during the curfew will be detained and taken to prison. After that, Sam goes home to meet his son Mike. He wants Mike to tell the truth about what happened that night, but Mike doesn't want to admit what they did at the carnival. Finally, Sam, as a father, only warns Mike not to leave the house and to close all the doors. He also wants Mike to warn his friends to do the same. The scene moves to Steve, who at that time is making out with Carol. The phone suddenly rings, which turns out to be from Mike, who just wants to let Steve know that even though the curfew has been set, he wants to invite his friends over to meet up and throw a party. Steve also agrees with the idea, then he hangs up the phone and resumes his activities with Carol. On the one hand, Sam, who is with Fox at the time, decides to go to Jacob's house. Nobody seems to answer their knocks, so they decide to break in. They get shocked when they find a dead body covered in maggots under Jacob's bed. Meanwhile, in the carnival area, Dr. Death's colleagues are gathering. One of them, Bishop Gate, wants Dr. Death to explain what happened. Dr. Death, who is forced to tell the story, finally explains that one of them had just been beaten up by the youths. As someone who wants to protect the community of people who are ostracized, Dr. Death performs a little ritual and he wants to avenge Jacob, who has died. Somewhere else, Carol thinks she is being bullied by Sam while they are making out in the cinema. Feeling uncomfortable, she keeps shouting Steve's name. But suddenly Steve appears with a hole in his body, and slowly his body falls in front of her. When Carol tries to save him, Jacob suddenly comes. He chases Carol and kills her by pulling her tongue out of her mouth. After Jacob has managed to kill them both, he suddenly looks like he is exhausted and just lays there. Luckily, Dr. Death comes at the right time and immediately saves him, while not long after, Sam and Fox come to the cinema after he sees Steve's car parked outside. When they get in, they are shocked when they see the bodies of Steve and Carol. As the situation worsens, Sam calls his son to tell him about the incident. Instead of obeying his father's request to stay home, Mike instead goes to the carnival to avenge the deaths of his friends. At that time, Sam is trying to check on Mike's condition, and what he finds instead is the presence of Dr. Death, who is sitting on a chair. While pointing a gun at him, Sam asks Dr. Death to tell him where Mike is. Suddenly, Bishop Gate appears from behind and makes Sam unconscious. Meanwhile, Mike, who is approaching the carnival at that time, doesn't realize that he is being approached by a man who comes to beat him up. When Mike comes back to his senses, he begins to misunderstand and feel like he is in another world. He hears Dr. Death's voice, and suddenly Mike sees his father's head that has been carved into a hideous thing. Finally, Mike has to die when Jacob comes to cut both his arms and break all of his teeth. At the end of the movie, after everyone who bullied Jacob dies, things slowly return to normal. Dr. Death even frankly tells visitors who come to the carnival that his collection comes from real human teeth. Meanwhile, Jacob is still alive with fresh blood stock to keep him alive. That is the end of the recap. Thank you for watching.